All my life, in my experience, the internet is ever growing, ever more connected, ever more open. But what about the future of the internet? Is there going to be a splinternet? And is that going to be chaos? Welcome to Threat Talks. My name is Lieuwe Koning, and here from the Security Operations Center at headquarters at Ontoit, we bring you the subject of today, which is Splinternet. Welcome to chaos. Let's get on to it. Welcome to Threat Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity. Let me introduce our guest of today, because who other would we want to talk to about the subject? Because we're going to take a look into the future of the internet, the future of connectivity. And with me is Peter van Burgel. Welcome. He is the CEO of AMS-IX, and AMS-IX is a worldwide leading connectivity platform. And lots of my packets that I have sent in my life over the internet is on his infrastructure. Peter, I'm thrilled to welcome you here. So when we're talking about the future, which is the favorite year somewhere in the future that you would like to go to if you could?
That's a very good question. I think maybe 150, 200 years from now.
200 years from now.
Yeah.
That means that it's a similar experience if you would have a night or so and show him an iPhone.
Yeah. Maybe boldly go where no one has gone before kind of future. Yeah.
You want to experience the magic.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I meant. We want to take a look into the future. Well, this is far ahead, but maybe today we'll talk about the little bit nearer future, I promise. But Peter, our regular viewers know all about you and about AMS-IX, but maybe for those who tune in recently, could you explain what AMS-IX does? What is it?
Yeah, so AMS-IX is a connectivity platform. We offer all kinds of internet access services, public peering, etc. Another name you could know us under is as an internet exchange. And we've been doing that for the past 30 years. And we're one of the largest in that field. So basically we bring together internet service providers and content and make sure that they can exchange that information effectively, efficiently, so that you and I as users have a good internet experience. So
you're, like what I said in the introduction, your experience is also that you connect networks
Absolutely.
together.
That's our bread and butter. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We talked. I said you look into the future, and not because you do this like in your weekends because you like to think about how things are going to be, but you actually make a science out of it. You've done this for years. And one word that we talked about before is scenario planning.
Correct.
Could you give us a little bit insight on how that works within AMS-IX?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah, so with scenario planning, we are trying to, I don't want to say predict the future, because we do apply.
I would go into a stockbroker.
Exactly, yeah. So we do apply an element of science to it, and that's that we work with trend watchers, and they help us to understand what the megatrends are. And megatrends you could think of how does mobility develop? How does urbanization develop? What are the trends in urbanization? What are the trends in AI? What are the trends in generations, etc.? So by looking at these trends, and of course there is an element of future in there as well. So large corporations have a strategy or a view of what they think the future is going to be like. And we take all of that input and we then look at our own business and see what of those trends is going to have an impact on what we do, that connectivity service we provide. And then by taking basically things that seem to be opposed to each other. So do we, for example, believe systems are going to be more open or more closed? Do we believe governments are going to be more proactive or reactive to how technology develops? And by putting those in crosshairs, so to say, we get all kinds of views on. So, for example, do we think systems are going to become more closed with active governments? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. What type of indicators can we identify that tell us that that's happening or not happening? And by following those indicators, we get a feel for how that trend is developing.
Yeah. So you look at really big developments, like
yes.
society sized, but it's not like you just walk one path. You just consider different possibilities.
Yes.
And make yourself a bit adaptable to this, so you know the different outcomes that the future could bring for you. Then at least you have thought about it a little bit in advance.
Yeah. So based on those trends, we have developed, for example, the recent one, we've developed 3 scenarios, and we're following all 3 of them. Mm-hmm. we already see that we thought one was developing more, and now with recent events, we see actually one of the others come up more prevalent.
What's something that you, of course, I'm always interested in things that don't go as planned. So what is a trend that a couple of years ago you thought was going to be big and now turns out to be on the sidetrack?
Yeah, so one of the things one of the other scenarios, or the first scenario, was that we thought that maybe technology would not continue to develop as fast as it has been, and one reason for that is that we think that ASML, the world leader in developing the chip machines, they need another 2 to 3 years before they can deliver the next generation machine. So it also means the next generation chips is going to take another 3 to 4 years before they can be released.
Yeah, so there's stalling Moore's law, more or less.
Yeah, so there's maybe a bit of a slowdown in the development of AI and how GPUs develop. And then DeepSeek came along, and all of a sudden it's not just about the raw horsepower of the chip, but it's also very much about how you design the AI and the engine. Uh-huh. So we actually saw an acceleration.
Yeah.
So that was one of the things where we thought, okay, scenario-wise, this may be having a big impact in the future. And then we thought, well, probably not. It's going to continue as fast as it is today, and maybe even accelerate with AI. So that's where we shifted to the other scenario we're going to talk about in more detail, which is Splinternet. Because we see more of that happening with some of the recent events on geopolitics and change of governments in a number of countries in the world.
Probably 3 years ago, you wouldn't predict that.
No, absolutely. 3 years ago, we were very much on the path of globalization and actually privacy. Who needs that on the internet? And open, more data hungry. And now we're seeing a lot of thought going into, well, do we want that? And how do we protect our privacy? And how do we protect our prime interest?
Shouldn't every organization do this?
Yes. Yeah, we can. Yes. Yeah. Of course, we could talk about the how, but yes. And it's a little bit like...
my understanding on your conference, AMS-IX organizes the More IP conference every year, and with your partners and customers. And you actually do this also in your ecosystem. And you offer this as a or service that maybe, I mean, it's not not just do it for yourself.
Yes and no. So yes, we do it for ourselves because, of course, we wanna have continuity as well. So we really plan for the future, but it's not something that we just want to keep to us. We believe in the way we work, working with our partners, working with our customers or suppliers. We can all benefit from this because if we better understand or have more people watching these indicators, then we have a better view of what's happening in the market. And therefore, we can all have a better strategy on how to deal with these changes. So yeah, we gladly share it, first and foremost. But also if there's customers or partners that want to do this and do actual scenario planning, then we would happily help them in developing those scenarios with them.
Okay, so they simply contact you personally?
Yes. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Well, takeaway number one, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So we talked a little bit about indeed Splinternet. That's one of the things that you've been thinking about, or you also refer to it as the Firewall Paradox. Before we get into that, some other things. Probably there's a lot of AI in there, I imagine.
Yes.
Yeah, and we said we're not going to talk about it today for a change. Everybody's already. Well, we'll do that another time, or last time, or whatever.
Yeah.
Anything else that springs to mind?
Well. And one of the scenarios we took is what if we are making our critical decisions not based on welfare, i.e. money, capitalism, but on well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So if...
what does that have to do with my internet connectivity?
Well, that's a good question. Because if it's about well-being and we look at how the internet is developing and all the worry we have around fake news and... how children are being affected by the internet and social media, then you could argue, well, that's maybe an element of well-being that we're currently not addressing. Mm-hmm. So if critical decisions were being made based on well-being, then it may actually give us a different internet. It may also mean that AI is maybe developed differently, actually in serving human being, and maybe having much more development in healthcare than in some of the other markets. So that's why we thought, well, at least we want to investigate that scenario. If well-being may be something that is triggering a lot of developments, because we believe we'll have very different decisions if it's not about the money, but about the well-being. And of course, we need the money to, of course, do the development. So it's not that we it's not throw away the money. But we believe, again, a scenario we need to
going
follow.
into a totalitarian communist state is not one of the scenarios.
No. So again, it's just having the options and having the ability to follow different trends and those different indicators that is giving us, and you said the word actually in your intro, is making us more adaptable, to adapt our strategy to respond to the things we're seeing. And because we're looking ahead 10 years, it's giving us a little bit of a runway to change our strategy, because it's not just happening to us. We're trying to plan for it because we're following these trends.
Yeah. Great. So the firewall paradox.
Yes.
Let's go deep dive a little bit more into that. What is it in the first place?
So this scenario, maybe in a couple of words, is that we believe that countries or groups of countries are basically pulling back onto their own turf and not trusting the other turf anymore. So you could argue a little bit of a Cold War situation, but then maybe more in digital space. And they become more closed. So they actually want to pull back and have their own security, but also maybe their own food supply and all kinds of other supplies organized by themselves. And it would also mean that actually they would have their own quote unquote internet. So you could argue
the opposite of globalization. That's what you're more or less talking about in a digital space.
Yeah. So where today I think the standard is we need to go global. This would be an scenario whereby there is maybe regional, but less global interaction. It's not the standard, so to say. And that means that more and more countries and or, like I said, like Europe, the US, China, you can see some of these large groups of countries. They basically become much more self-sufficient. And then in this particular scenario, we believe there is at least one thing where we still need to unite, and that's the environment, because we all live in the same environment and we need to figure out how to deal with that. And again, those challenges are real. So where for many things, countries pull back and become more self-sufficient and basically get distance from other countries, for the environment, we still need to work together. And therefore, we believe that could also mean that there is more and more Splinternet type developments. So you could argue that, for example, that China already has their own internet, with the way, for example, the US looks at things like privacy, different than Europe. You could argue the European internet is different than the American internet. So to some extent, we see it already happening.
It's just not on a, do you mean not on a technical level yet, or
no,
at all?
No, so it's still open, so you can still get to any website in the US and on a bit technical, on an IP routing switching level, it's all still very open. But on a more application and data level, we see the first signs of governments basically want to control what's happening on that open infrastructure. So
is that mostly between United States and Europe, you think, or is that? I mean, nobody really hosts their stuff on the Chinese clouds, huh?
Well, you say nobody, but they're quite substantial. And a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, for example, or the Middle East, have no issue with hosting their data in China. So the Western view very much is that there is indeed a bit of a tug of war going on between the US and Europe. And there's a lot of law and regulation in Europe, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, and all these things. And from the US, they're looking at it and basically saying, well, you're shooting yourself in the foot because you're stalling innovation with all these laws and regulations. So they are very much of the opinion, open market, not too much regulation, go, go, go. So yes, to some extent, it's between Europe and the US. But again, if you go to different parts of the world, we look at China in a certain way, but they look at China in a different way and see them as a viable partner and work with them. So again, the different views from the different parts of the world are important, also in your scenario planning, specifically if you, like us, are a company that works globally.
You visit a lot of different areas in the world. So what's the perspective of the Middle East or China on whether Splinternet maybe already exists? Is that, but like I said, I'm used to being able to connect to everything. The reason I, in my view, have a disconnect with China is that I don't speak Chinese, right? But my browser actually can translate it now. So in my idea, I still have open internet. But what's the vision of other parts of the world outside of Europe and United States?
So it's interesting you ask. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago that was specifically aimed at Africa, the continent, and we talk often about Africa if it's a country, but it's 56 countries. And as a continent, it's bigger than Europe, the US, and the Middle East together.
Yeah, it's worse than Europe in terms of not aligning.
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. But during that conference, there were two things actually happening. One, there were the demonstrations in Kenya. Maybe you remember that a couple of weeks ago. And the Kenyan government wanted to shut down the internet because a lot of that happened over the internet, and they felt, well, this is actually a threat to the government, and they told Kenya Telecom basically shut down the internet. And they couldn't because of the way the internet works. We all know about the Great Firewall in China, right? So they have a very different view on what the Chinese people can and cannot see, and they believe they are in their right. It's actually to the benefit of the people to do this.
Yeah. So the mental picture of how a Chinese government or maybe even a Chinese citizen looks at the openness of internet, that's not even a feature.
No.
The feature is that you curate the data that your public has access to.
Yeah.
And it's much more their point of view then.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe to add two more examples. In the Middle East, the whole societal structure is different. And again, they are the people are to some extent happy that the government is taking care of them and keep them safe. So it's a different social contract than we have in many European countries. So they're also okay with some limitations on the internet. The other one that is very interesting, a couple of months ago, J.D. Vance, the vice president of the US, was in Europe, in Munich, remember, at the security conference. And he had this presentation about censorship. And whether or not you agree is not the point for this, but actually it showed their view where they actually said, well, if you look at the Digital Service Act, the AI Act, and all these things, GDPR, Europe, are censoring the data because you're saying you cannot share this, you cannot share that. Whereas in the US, we're not censoring. You can do anything you want. Well, let's not go into whether he was right or wrong. But again, it's giving that very different mental view on how they look.
Of recognizing this, that it can be one or the other, and you need to have a plan for both.
Yes. But it also means that if you work with international companies, and we have no choice. The internet is an open system, and therefore we work with international companies. Those companies and those countries come with a set of values that they put into their technology and into their way of working.
If you talk to the European lawmakers about the GDPR, for example, what their view is, we enforce our views of GDPR on the world because now the big cloud, and of course that's aimed at the European people.
Yeah.
But if you have to abide by the laws, and I mean the European market is bigger than the US market combined, so it for Microsoft or Google, there's no way you're not going to sell to Europe. So they have to comply with that, and then since they have all that, then it also applies to the US market. So by putting GDPR out, the European government actually creates GDPR for the US people as well, and Canada, right? And now they try to do the same with the AI Act, and that seems to be less effective. But I know, because I spoke to a few people about this, that was actually their aim. And now, my iPhone has crippled AI because Apple refuses to deliver this to the European market as a result. So that's where you see that kind of split.
Yeah, but it works both ways, of course, right? So if you look at sanctions, and again, I mentioned ASML earlier in the call, ASML is not allowed to sell their latest version machines to China if it's up to the US. They don't want that.
Yeah, they changed that. Did you read that?
So again, but
it's now open again. Because
it's a lost
cause anyway, yeah.
But still, the US is also trying to impose. And it's not about the US or Europe or China.
Huawei equipment in Europe and in America. And then we import lots of Chinese cars that are full with cameras and we checked.
Yeah.
Of course, out of curiosity, they all found home to China. So
yeah. So back to the topic of Splinternet, right? It's the technology is one bit of it, and you opened to say, well, I'm used to actually everything being open and growing and being able to get to anywhere. And I think that's still the sort of the utopian, the romantic promise of the internet, that you can start a business in your attic, right, and be a global company in a number of years. However, the geopolitics are more and more seeping into that and are forcing us, everybody, to think about, how do I deal with that? How do I protect my critical assets, knowing that I cannot do without the current hyperscalers, US companies. We cannot prevent Chinese cars coming into Europe. We cannot, because we're a global open society. So it's much more, How do we deal with that? Recognizing that it's what it is. So we just have to figure out how to deal with it, because blocking it is not the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to be clear, so if you're thinking about how your job is to connect all those continents together, and at some point, say there is a Splinternet requirement by a government, that you are part of the switch then to switch it on or off, or is it not? Is that not part of your scenario?
No. So the way we work with our partners globally is that when we start the partnership, we are very clear to say our standard is open, neutral. Everybody should be able to connect. So there's no paywalls or things like that actually prevent people to connect to our platform. However, on a higher layer, of course, within the stack, companies could decide, well, we don't want this to connect. We don't see that.
Yeah, it's a bit like the air is everywhere around the world, so everybody can fly a plane, but whether you're allowed to fly the plane or whether you put what kind of barriers, that's up to the local governments.
Or maybe a slightly different example in that same area. If you think of the roads, we're offering the road, but we're not checking what's on the road, in the sense that we're not checking every lorry and every car if they're doing anything.
So there can be border control everywhere, and that's up to them.
Yeah,
you just make sure that. Okay.
Yeah. And if they would actually ask us switch it off, then we would, but we would pack up and go.
We would have to.
But then we would pack up and go. So we do not want to be part of that.
Okay. And you mentioned figure out where your data is. Almost every company, at least in Europe and the United States and Canada, use some kind of a cloud service. I mean, there's no way you do email without either Google or Office 365 these days. So everybody has data there. Yeah. Is that something that is also part of this scenario that you think about it?
Yes. Yeah. So start to think. So if you think in government terms, maybe a little bit easier. So if you have national secrets, confidential information that you really want to keep secret on a national level, maybe you don't want to store that in the public cloud. If you are a high-tech company and there's a lot of intellectual property and patents and things like that, again, think about whether or not you want to keep that in a public cloud. So by thinking about your critical assets, your crown jewels, or how you want to call it, your DNA, and treat that differently than maybe your marketing brochures or your public website. And
they're supposed to get out.
Well, there's that.
But data leak in marketing material is actually a feature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, but really starting to think about how to do that. Also think about things like encryption. Right? Do you want to, and of course there's post-quantum encryption and we could talk about that at a different time, but start to think about how you protect your critical assets. So it's a little bit like your house, right? You have a lock on your front door. Maybe you have a safe in your house where you put your jewelry. So it's thinking about it in layers and thinking about your critical assets and how do I protect those. And there's many options to do that without having to say, we don't want to work with hyperscalers anymore. No.
It sounds a bit like you want to have choice.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that, we talked about a thing like resilience before. How does that, the term means a lot to many people, of course. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think there's two.
If I think of an internet exchange, your route, it's two routers instead of one. That's resilience, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then resilience is redundancy. Yeah, it's all a bit semantic part. But another word we hear all day long is sovereignty. How do we remain sovereign? What does that mean? And for us, sovereignty means you have choice without. You can make a choice without having a gun to your head, so to say. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of what we mean with sovereignty, and that is actually giving us an element of resilience. Because if we have the option to go left or right, or pull out, or maybe step forward, it's making us more resilient, so that we can actually deal with situations that are thrown our way. And whether that is in terms of connectivity, so redundancy of the network, or whether that is where is my data stored and can I get to it no matter what. That's for us an element of resilience.
So you have, you at least your goal is to have each piece of data that you hold, and maybe that's locally, has a local scope, for example. Every piece of data you think of, where can I store it? And maybe there's a higher cost if I don't use the cloud, or maybe lower cost, whatever. You're thinking in those terms.
Yes.
You have customers all over the world. And suppose there's the pitch black scenario, and we have Europe, we have China, we have Africa, we have United States, and we have Canada and Australia for whatnot, and they all disconnect except that the roads are still there, but nothing passes. Then your goal is to be prepared for that, so that each entity can more or less independently store locally. Is that the extent of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I want to be slightly careful there. So what often happens in these discussions is that it becomes a bit like a big red button type discussion, right? So it's a full blackout, or somebody pushes a red button and everything breaks and nothing works anymore. I'm not sure if that's a likely scenario. We need to plan for that because, look at Spain, right? They had a national power outage and it was, of course, a significant issue. So we do need to plan.
Nothing to do with cyber or infrastructure. So it was a human error, eh?
That's what we hear. Still, if you want to plan for that eventuality, then you need to start to think about it. But there's also, if you look at it differently, I was talking to a CIO of a large bank, international global bank, and they said, well, we finished a project where we actually consolidated a lot of the data into Europe, a lot of it actually here in the Netherlands. And then he said, well, then our Polish office got a letter from the Polish government to say that anything that had to do with Polish customers for the bank had to be stored in Poland. So it's actually the government then forcing that company to actually bring the data there because they want the data to be local. So
any company, every company should be aware that these things can happen and become agile enough, in your words, resilient, to quickly adapt to that situation, to the geopolitical situation that may arise. Then,
So first of all, the awareness. If you an old management wisdom, if you can't see it, you can't manage it. So first, the awareness of if I put everything in one cloud, maybe I'm too dependent on that one solution. So think about choice, but that starts with realizing what is my critical asset and how do I protect that. Do I need to create redundancy for that, etc.? So just by starting and having these small steps, there is a lot you can do in terms of resilience and redundancy. Yeah,
resilience for me means something completely different.
Well, I was going to say, because you're in a different business as security. So what does it mean for you?
Yeah, so like you said, resilience. You build a backup system that if one fails, the other one starts, or a backup option, something. And to me, if for one of our customers data gets exfiltrated, of course, there's a backup to restore it if it's in terms of ransomware, for example. But the point is that first event cannot happen because I cannot back up the data is already out.
Lost is lost. Yeah.
So for me, resilience is if someone tries to get in, there's yet another barrier, another barrier. So it's more like a pushback to me.
Yeah.
And it's it's funny how these terms from market to market slightly differ in meaning, but the higher goal is the same.
Absolutely,
you withstand some kind of pressure, and can still live on, basically. Yeah.
And again, let's not digress, but there's also the resilience of the individual having to deal with that. Are you capable of actually dealing with those adversities?
Yeah.
It means different things, but you're right. It's absolutely the same goal to actually remain in business or. Remain in business, period.
You mentioned the resiliency of an individual. That's also part of your scenarios, probably. Huh?
So we do recognize that all the geopolitical developments are also having an effect on people, you and me, but also our employees. We have...
they worry about nukes flying over.
I'm not sure if they worry about nukes, although we have a number of people working for us in the Middle East that are familiar with rockets flying because they have been part of wars before. But it's also that we have a couple of people from the Ukraine. So they have a very different view on resilience and how to deal with that than people that have never, people from the Netherlands have never had any conflict like they have in the Ukraine. So it's also about working with your team and with your people to also deal with that. Because like it or not, that geopolitics is also coming into your company through your people.
The scenario planning business is everywhere.
Yes.
I want to talk to you in a minute about what needs to happen if there is a Splinternet. Because we still need to agree on protocols, for example. But before we do, we always have our treasure hunt. And I want to give the opportunity to our audience to win one of those great T-shirts that some people actually collect. So the first 200 people that send the following code to us will get one shipped. So take note, I only say it once, 052508. Email us at code@threat-talks.com. So, Peter, we said about the Splinternet, if that's there. Hey, you mentioned already the roads and everything, but the roads, one of the rules we had on the roads, at least in Europe and America, we drive on the right side, for example. So there's this rule. And it's really handy that we don't, if we cross a border, have to switch.
We do sometimes.
We do sometimes, but and therefore we know how important it is that we have some in a Splinternet world. So, and say this develops in a direction that we at least don't want, where it's more where we have the European internet or maybe even the Dutch internet, and we have the Texas internet, and we have who knows. There's still a need to collaborate. You mentioned before on whole other topics like global warming. There's no other. I mean, it doesn't matter where the CO2 gets into the air. That's one clear. Another example that springs to mind to me is the International Space Station, for example, where the Americans and the Russians, although they are not really friends for considerable decades, or it varies a little bit, they still work together there. What about you as AMS-IX? I mean, you are also everywhere. So for you, it means something if that is going to be troubling. Yeah. Is there a way? Do you think about these things?
Of course, we do.
What's the solution?
Well, I don't know if there's one solution, but again, in the scenario planning we're doing and the way we think about it is that, like I said, in the scenario, the Firewall Paradox scenario we wrote, we think that the environment, for example, is the binding factor, and therefore there needs to be communication about the environment. But you can also think of a banking system, for example. If payments need to happen, you still need to be able to. And there's actually an interesting fact. If you look at the major Roman cities 2,000 years ago, and you look at the Silk Route from China, even further back, and you look at the current roads, the major freeways and highways and the major cities, it's still those cities and those places where people come together, and it's still those roads. So when we now look at digital infrastructure, a lot of the digital infrastructure is aligned with those roads and cities. And the reason why I bring that up is that I think communication and travel back in the day, now digital communication or travel of data, is crucial for the world, but also for nations to function. So I do believe that we will always have to have the need and the ability to communicate. So we may not communicate like friends anymore, but we still need to have the ability to communicate.
So we need some kind of international space station between the internets of China, Russia, Europe, America.
Yeah, and within that scenario, we call that Earth-IX.
Earth-IX.
Yeah, we had to give it a name, so we call it Earth-IX. But you could argue it's a little bit like the International Space Station or the UN, where companies or countries still can come together and exchange information that is critical to the functioning of the world, basically, but including also functioning to them individually.
Does it exist already? Or?
No, it doesn't, because the internet is highly distributed and therefore it's not needed. But you could argue again, Amsterdam is a major hub for international traffic. A lot of the European traffic flows through Amsterdam. So you could argue Amsterdam is one of the international space stations where that happens. But this, we believe, is also at a higher level again within the stack. So it also means you need to have agreement on how you communicate with each other. What do you communicate? What are the standards? Is it encrypted? Yes or not? So again,
this is more than a government job then.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very much about diplomacy almost. But then digital diplomacy. How do you keep information flowing and keep trade and the world going while companies are pulling back?
So you see there's a possible scenario that there is indeed some kind of international body that governs this somehow, and that's not a political initiative, but a private sector initiative. Then, AMS-IX would team up with, I don't know who is the equivalent. Are you in China? Not that much. No. So there's probably some peer there that you would work with. That's what the possible outcome is.
It could be. We don't know. It could be still government driven. Like I said, it could be under the UN maybe even. But we could be one of the technology providers that is making that possible. Or what you also need to know, I didn't tell that about AMS-IX in the beginning. So we are a limited company, but we have a association, a non-profit association as shareholder. And that means therefore that we are independent of any financial backing and investments, because we have that association as the shareholder. And the benefit of that is that we are, first of all, neutral. So we can choose, we have that sovereignty. We can decide who we want to work with or not.
But would the Chinese see you as neutral though?
I don't know.
You haven't asked.
I haven't asked.
Yeah, okay.
But in the past 30 years, not just us, but also other IXs that work in the same fashion or the same way, have that trust at least that because of that structure, we can act independently. And that also means, therefore, like I said earlier, if one of our partners or governments would come to us and say, hey, you need to lock out this customer, we say, well, we're going to lock out the system and we're going to go, because it's not what we want. So again, that neutrality, we really try and enforce in what we do. So yes, we think we can be one of those players, but whether or not everybody will recognize it, like you say, I don't know, time will tell. And time will tell if it's needed. It may not be needed. It's a scenario.
It'll work if it's needed.
We like to believe so, yes.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of change that we have to plan for. Is there any advice you could give to our audience, or if you're intrigued by these kind of stories and way of thinking? Where do we start? I mean, because like you said, it's not like a red button, huh? But those things go gradually. What would you recommend your peer CEOs to do?
Yeah. Well, I think the very simple one is start, right? But then where do you start? What do you start with? And I think, first of all, it's having that discussion with your CIO or your CISO and start thinking about, so what are my critical assets and how do I protect those? And that could be, if you're in production, it could be your factory. But you always need to realize that whatever we do nowadays, it's digital. So it doesn't matter if we had an outage of one of the providers, and some people were complaining about the fact, I didn't know where to go because my navigation system didn't work anymore.
The mobile network actually was down this morning here.
Exactly, right? So that's, you see how ingrained it is within whatever we do. You can't get on a train, you can't pay in the supermarket, you cannot make a phone call anymor.
But you are CEO of a tech company, right? So you kind of understand all this stuff, and if not, then there's a lot of people around you that do. I can imagine that if you are in a different business, this is super hard.
It is. So again, as a board, maybe not just the CEO, but as a board, work out what are your critical assets, realizing that there's a 99% chance there is a digital component in it. Take that seriously. And then start to figure out, so where actually are these assets and where is my data? What is my critical data? Is that my customer data? Is that my intellectual property of the stuff I make? Is it my invoicing data? Is it threat intel information? What is my critical asset in terms of data? Then start to figure out, where is it? Is it in a safe place? Can I move it around if I have to? So just by going through these steps, step by step, I think there's a lot you can do already in becoming much more resilient and keep your sovereignty.
It's funny because everything you say from a security perspective is the thing we try to push if in every organization to think like this, think in data. Yeah. And then of course, every piece of data to us is we need to protect it as well to hackers and attacks. So it's really,
so if not, work with companies like you, right? And get that help. So if you're not tech savvy or digital savvy, work with companies that can help you identify that and also come up with solutions on how to do it. Absolutely, yeah.
So you can also learn from the huge corporates like IKEA and stuff. They because they have this, they have whole departments to do this.
Absolutely, Royal Shell.
The knowledge is out there. You just have to make sure you get it into your company. Thank you very much. This was
thank you.
Nice peek into the future. Let's see how far we get into the Splinternet and how chaotic it will be, or maybe it's going to be amazing experience. Yeah. And the key thing, I think, is you need to give yourself options, be resilient, and make yourself agile by having choice and be adaptable and start do this continuously.
Agreed. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And our audience also, thank you for tuning in. If you liked today, this episode, please like it on in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. Because that helps us spread the word further. We'd really appreciate it. And you can also subscribe to us. Then next week you will get the next episode of Threat Talks in your inbox. And we'd love to talk to you back to you again then. Thank you very much once again, and bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by Onto It Cybersecurity and AMS-IX. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.